Well, now between the jigs and the reels, we haven't put out a one-to-one session in quite a while, but we're back with a really, really interesting guest who he always speaks from the heart, whether you agree with him or not, and he has the most wonderful way with words. Terry McMahon is a multi-award-winning movie director, producer, actor, and unlike so many of his colleagues in the entertainment industry, he has chosen to speak up against the government and global narrative. And he joins us now. Terry, thank you for allowing us the time and giving us your time today to have a chat. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here, Ashley. I'm in my son's room, so if it looks weird behind me, don't take any notice of it.
And as a dad, you know, there you are in your son's room. This is an alarming time for all parents. They want to inject our children with this experimental gene therapy, essentially is what it is, even though we're not allowed to say that. How are you doing? How's your head coping with all of this?
Well, it's interesting because the idea of what's unfolding in front of us was horrific beyond comprehension only 2 years ago. And now we've normalized that obscenity to such a degree that we have people who think the mandatory vaccination of children is a good thing. Now, for us to go on that journey in only 2 years is terrifying. And this has nothing to do with vaccination or anti-vax or pro-vax or any of this stuff as far as I'm concerned. Because people, every individual has a very, very different perspective on that. And my vaccination status I regard as irrelevant in the context of this conversation. But as a parent, and I said recently in a speech that, and I got into trouble for it, like many aspects of it, but one of the things I said was that, and this is not to diminish anybody, but people who have children, by necessity, by imposition, with no choice of their own, have got to see the world differently than they had before they had children. It's a simple reality. You're no longer driven by ego. You're no longer driven by a singular independent idea of the world. Your worldview has got to, by necessity, shift immediately. Either that or you're a selfish narcissist. But I know that you have 3 children, I have 5 children, and the idea of my worldview being the same as it was before I had children is absurd and ridiculous. And I find too often these days we have decisions being made about our children's future by people who've never had children, people who know nothing about the most fundamental, basic aspect of having children. And I find that concept far more frightening than a vax or pro-vax or anti-vax movement. I find it terrifying that the government, through the permission of the people and the facilitation of the people, and it's something we should not forget, that we have facilitated the power been granted to the government over the bodily autonomy of ourselves, and then the next stage in the most disturbing precedent in, I think, modern history, our children.
Well, I find it absolutely terrifying, you know, and I want to stay strong, and I don't want to have fear, because I think fear is a big problem for us. I think this is what's driven people to make crazy decisions and not research. And I think, you know, as parents, whatever about, if you didn't do the research for yourself, private independent research that's necessary to understand what is in this. I know you don't want to go into the vax, pro-vax, anti-vax, but really and truly, it is where we're at, because we have to ask, what the hell's in this thing, and why do they want to do a mandatory vaccination program on all the children, on all of us, when initially they said, well, the kids are fine, you know, they're not a problem, they're not a threat to this. And we seem to be just getting lies heaped on more lies, heaped on more lies. Now it's like, oh, actually the kids are a threat and they need their jabs. And as you say, the worrying thing is how people in the space of 2 years are now going, yes, that's a great idea. What is it? Is it some kind of mass psychosis, or how do you see it? What's going on? Because from my perspective, looking on from France, I would say people aren't thinking straight. They're not thinking logically, that the way I would assume Irish people to debate and, you know, talk it out before making a big decision.
Well, when I say I don't want to get into the vax, anti-vax things, it's not that I don't have very strong opinions on this. It's that people's absolute refusal to engage in a conversation beyond their chosen or imposed side has made the conversation impossible. And for me, one of the glories of being a human being in conversation is that I love being proven wrong. I love being educated. I love being given an insight that I had hitherto never thought of. But we exist in a realm where having the wrong opinion is damaging enough, but asking the wrong question is as equally damaging. And when we criminalize or demonize somebody for asking a question, a good faith question, when we criminalize somebody for doing that, we're in a deeply disturbing scenario. So one of the things I'm trying to avoid doing is getting into a choosing of sides, hence my vaccination status being irrelevant. But in terms of mass psychosis, what I do is I create narratives. And we create a fictional narrative on a screen that you hope has the effect of creating a cathartic response in reality in the viewer. And that's the standard structure requirement of all dramatic structure. We do it with music, we do it with across the board. But now we have governments hiring very expensive organizations to teach them in the pursuit of truth is what the function of art is. But in order to pursue that truth, we need a construct. Now we have these governments creating constructs that are fallacies, but they are as equally dramatically and emotionally as effective as a truth pursuit would be. So when I see this idea of somebody deciding that they want to form an orderly queue with their hand on their child's shoulder as they demonstrate a public support for a mandatory vaccination program, I don't feel anger towards them. I feel heartbroken. Like the fact that you would even conceive of putting your child, if there was a 0.00001% possibility of your child breaking a fingernail, surely your instinct as a parent is to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, we take risks every day with our children, and those risks are necessary. But those are risks that are about embracing life, embracing discovery, embracing the things that allow you to understand and comprehend the difference between actual danger versus fear. And nothing will kill you faster than fear. And to watch how fear has been commodified and turned into a deeply disturbing weapon in the name of protecting us, it's really frightening when people can't see that. So beyond your position on vax or vaccination or anti-vaccination, whatever reductive terms we apply here, if as a parent you can't see how you are being manipulated and exploited and how your fear has been weaponized, you really are deliberately deaf, dumb, and blind. Now that's even if you 100% agree with the vaccination process. We have been led down a garden path by bona fide, verifiable liars. People whose history is there for anybody to investigate. It's not a conspiracy. And these very often people who will be diagnosed as psychopaths are telling us that our future and the future of our children should be adhered to based on claims that they're making. In Ireland, we have the head of NEFIT, who is a man who, for many people, should be in jail. A man who protected the information and stopped the information that might have saved women's lives. A man who went forcibly against an investigation of the cervical cancer scandal. And you watch this man and every instinct in your body tells you he's ropey, but you could have people that you find ropey and you subsequently end up liking. And you go, my instinct was wrong. They're good people. But when somebody has a clearly defined track record of lies, deceit, duplicity, and then won't even have the courtesy to apologize for the deaths of these women. And now he's not only rewarded, he's given the freedom of the city, and he's given the destiny of our children and our future into his hands. That's beyond any comprehension. That's a psychosis that we've got to question ourselves in terms of our culpability, our facilitation. How we have allowed this psychopath to make decisions for our children's future is beyond any comprehension.
No, sorry, it broke up a little bit there, the connection. But Terry, I want to talk to you about the entertainment industry, your industry. Okay, I mean, you know Hollywood, you know the industry at home. You've made movies. You've been in Batman Begins in 2005. And then the role of these influencers, the celebrities, you'd like the likes of Jennifer Aniston saying, unless you're jabbed, you're not going to be my friend. And people, of course, are very influenced by celebrity. And I think it's just added another layer of confusion onto the whole thing. Why do you think, first of all, so many of your colleagues in the entertainment industry are saying nothing? The ones who would have been outspoken in the past, would have stood up for all the causes, would have always thrown their tuppence worth in. We're hearing nothing from them now. And also, why have these celebrities, the other ones, been pushing this experimental injection on the wider public the way they have? Your take, please.
Well, again, there's a large part of our so-called community that have been pandering to mediocrity for decades. And the representation or appearance of rebellious artistry has always been a scam, always been a con. But there are other people who I find it heartbreaking, their silence, their acquiescence. At a time when people talk about 1984, George Orwell's book, all the time, and how this is some kind of replica for that. But if you read the book is a tragic love story. And it's about the destruction of intimacy and the destruction of the human need to connect. And artists, that's their job. Their job is to connect in that ethereal, remarkable way that allows us to transcend the limitations of reality. And when they shut down all the venues, when they shut down everything, it was devastating for the venues. It was all those things, but the artists and the community and the audience were disconnected. And I was waiting for somebody to break into an empty building. I was waiting for someone to stand on a street corner to put on a free gig. Nothing happened. Even at its worst in the concentration camps, when the consequence of being caught would be severe beating or sometimes death, they still played music. They still recited poetry. They still performed theater in the camps. Yeah. The fact that in the last 2 years, or 18 months, whatever time frame it is, that we have almost no artists on any level who have done anything except apply for government bursaries, which were to essentially anesthetize or paralyze them. And then some of those people didn't even get that. We knew someone like Christy Dignam in Aslan applying for a bursary and being turned down. And he can't even pay his mortgage. But I think the most devastating thing is not just the acquiescence, but then when celebrities use their so-called influence to talk to people who like them and to convince those people to take an experimental drug into their body because the celebrity told them to do it. I think that's a level of double dealing with the devil and with celebrity that I think we're going to be interrogating and examining in decades to come, to ask how did we create a lie so effective that people who know nothing whatsoever about the thing they're peddling are willing to put their entire reputation on it and try to convince sometimes millions of people to put their life and the lives of their children on the line. It's beyond comprehension.
It's been an incredibly revealing time in terms of viewing other people's characters and our own, and asking ourselves some very deep questions. I'd love to get your take on the homelessness situation in Ireland, because I know you yourself found yourself with no home when you first went up from Mullingar to Dublin. So you know this story very well. You know what it's like to have nothing, and to be cold, and to be without a home. And I know when I'm looking on again from a distance, but sometimes that's a good thing, at the homelessness situation in Dublin and across Ireland, it's pretty shocking, especially this time of year when it's freezing. It's so cold, and there's all this money for this experiment, but no money for the homeless. And again, they're saying now that these guys have to take the injection. That the homeless people have to take the injection if they want to have a roof over their heads. So it's just another layer of the madness.
Well, it's interesting because our current Minister for Defence and Minister for Foreign Affairs, he was involved in housing children as a minister before he was promoted into his current position. And he guaranteed those children who were living in squalid hotels that he would have them out of those hotels by Christmas. He guaranteed it. Now, those children, can you imagine what it's like to be those children and to be told in no uncertain terms that you will be out by Christmas? Then he left his position, he was promoted, and those children were forgotten. Now, when I was homeless, I was a teenager, but the one thing that you had was hope. And what they're doing is they were raising hope. What they're doing is they're telling us that there's no future unless it's ordained by them. Mm-hmm. And when we have someone like Simon Coveney leading our defense forces, who were already eviscerated by the state, and being our Minister for Foreign Affairs, and this man is a verifiable liar who has no problem lying to homeless children about effectively cancelling Christmas. And yet we got to look at him now and trust him that he has our best interest at heart. Mm. We got to look at homeless people and trust the charities behind them, that they're going to look after them. It's again, what's heartbreaking to me is that I'm interested in verifiable truth or verifiable fallacy. The rest is just opinion, and the rest is just feeling, and that changes and should change all the time. But like I said, we have these men and these women in these positions of power who have a track record of psychotic, verifiable behavior, and yet we're still looking to them for answers about how to get out of this scenario, a scenario that they themselves are part of the construct of. But I think even the wider thing, actually, when we talk about what it means to be vulnerable effectively, so let's not just talk about the homeless, but the idea of anybody who's vulnerable. In Germany last week, there was a man who made a fake pass for his wife in work, a green pass or a COVID pass, whatever you want to call it. Now, this thing didn't even exist 6 months ago, but he had to make it for her. She was frightened of the vaccine because she'd been vaccine injured, apparently. But he made this for her. Her boss found out it was fake, and her boss threatened to go to the state. The man went home and he wrote a letter. And in the letter, he said how terrified he was that we now exist in a world where the state can step in and take their children. Then he took a gun, he shot his wife, he shot his 3 children, and he shot himself dead. 5 people dead. Now that story should be the international story being had in every country around the world. That something that didn't even exist 6 months prior is now so strong in its creation of fear that somebody so mentally vulnerable can murder his beloved children and his beloved wife and himself for fear of the state interjecting. And we now exist in a realm where people are telling us every day that unless we abide by a fear-fueled narrative, we're either going to be killed in terms of the virus, or we're going to be ostracized by society, which is its own form of killing. Mm-hmm. And those are our 2 options. Now, I had COVID. I experienced it firsthand. I took ivermectin. I did all the things that I'm told you can and cannot do. I use it as an opportunity to examine and explore the reality of it. And I know that COVID can be dangerous for some people, and I think it's imperative that those people are not disrespected. But at the same time, it's very, very obvious. And this part of the problem is that multiple things can be true at once. And we have a tendency to reject the idea that multiple things can be true at once because it makes us vulnerable, it makes us insecure, and it also makes us possibly wrong. And I think it's imperative we embrace the idea of being possibly wrong. But it's very, very clear that while COVID is dangerous to some people, there is something other than a virus going on in the world. And if you can't see that, if you refuse to see that, and if you refuse to see it based on fear, that's understandable. But if your refusal to see it then turns into a rush for prejudice and rage and accusation, it's only a matter of time before the homeless will become the next step to we need to imprison or reduce the rights of or eradicate these people. There's no time in history where we haven't set a precedent like we're setting now that it did not end up horribly. The moment we...
It's already going horribly wrong, though. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Australia with the Aboriginal people, I mean, it's right before our eyes. They've cut off communication. They're putting them in detention centres, concentration camps, if you like, forcing them to be injected against their will. It's happening in India. what do we do, though? I mean, people say if you protest, that's not enough. Is it mass non-compliance? How do we, as Irish people and as citizens of the world, get our power back?
But again, it's the idea of power. Even we abdicated because we've got to recognize our culpability here. We are not just victims here. We are culpable in this. We allowed woke culture to take over our country. Like, how the hell did we allow the idea of critical race theory enter our universities? We've allowed the idea of a very specific and particular type of sex education to take over everything. We've allowed our children to be used as indoctrination models for an ideological war. We've allowed a tiny, tiny minority of people whose rights should be protected on every level, but the activists behind that ideology have suddenly, like a virus much worse than COVID, spread everywhere. And we've allowed this to happen. We've allowed the worst, weakest of us to control all of us. And again, it's back to that simple thing. You know, I keep on looking at the conspiracy theorists versus the fact checkers. And again, over the last 2 years, I keep on waiting, looking for where the conspiracy theorists are wrong. Now, there are some extremes, like very, very too extreme, that are just nut jobs. And they actually do damage, because I read a report yesterday that was published in I think the journal.ie or some rag, but the idea of how we are moving toward the far right. And we are using these extreme examples in order to discredit everyone else, anyone else who questions the narrative. But looking at the idea of what do we do, again, back to our artists. Our artists, there hasn't been a single piece on any level of any interest created in relation to COVID. Nothing.
And is that because they're afraid of losing funds or being cancelled, or that's the end of their career and it's over if they do?
I was cancelled. I was publicly cancelled. I know what it's like. It's a fucking horrible, horrible process. And I was cancelled by one of the creators of the repeal shield. Apparently, I asked some of the wrong questions when it came to repeal. Apparently, asking questions about the most vulnerable life form is the wrong question to ask. And I was very much pro-repeal when it began. But I was contacted by a few people, and the people behind repeal were saying that if anybody has any questions, please ask them. We really want to answer. So I asked some questions, and they were massively respectful every time, and so on and so forth. But the response was astonishing. And then I was repeal shielded, as they call it. And then it turned out there's over 50,000 people repeal shielded. And the way they got back at me then later was I did an interview with Paddy Houlihan, and this was the one that destroyed Paddy's aspirations. And it was, again, a deliberately recontextualized conversation. And the conversation was about cancel culture. It nearly destroyed his career. And then there wasn't enough of them. They came after me as well. And they used my daughter. They weaponized my daughter to try and destroy me. And these are people who talk about compassion, people who talk about humanity and understanding and so on and so forth. So we've handed over the meaning of words. We don't know what compassion means anymore. We don't know what any of these words mean anymore. They have all been weaponized. So when we look at our culture, COVID is not our problem. COVID is 99% survivable. But and again, I hate to use phrases like this, but our moral bankruptcy is the problem. Our shallow attempt at claiming to be things we are not and presenting ourselves as things we know we're not, in pursuit of things we know are lies, governed by people we know are psychopaths. Like all of the groundwork for COVID and the madness that the government is presenting as fact, all that groundwork has been laid over the last 10 and 15 years anyway. We have, again, you mentioned the homeless people. And while we had the highest homeless number since the famine, we had a government who was declaring the greatest success in terms of housing projects. You go, what? And while this was happening, we had foreign companies and their investors being protected. We had banks crippling families and destroying them and handing the properties over to foreign investors. So when we look at these people who lie to your face, it's like Jimmy Savile says, I feel guilty what I did. Can I babysit your children? And you go, oh yeah, let's allow them to babysit our children. We've allowed psychopaths to determine reality. And a psychopath has no comprehension of reality.
Now, you escaped the education system early, and you're clearly well able to think for yourself. You know, there's a big problem with critical thinkers. We have a lot of people with letters after their names. We have a lot of people who are doctors, PhD. they're clearly smart, they're clearly very good at what they do, but they are not willing to question this narrative. They're not willing to be seen as, it's like, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but, or I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but. It's like, why would you even bring that up? That's falling for it. I feel when people have to say that, they've fallen for the trick. And do you feel like you were lucky that you got out of the education system early and, did your own university of life to figure things out?
No, I don't, because I went to a vocational school in Mullingar. It was the poor people's school. Right. And it was the school that I wasn't even supposed to go to. And I had to defy the Christian Brothers to go there. So again, while the Christian Brothers were raping children, and literally the Christian brother we had is now currently in jail for raping children, he and those he represented were seen as the righteous, the intelligent, and the morally appropriate people to follow. Look at the parallel. But I refused to be involved with them, and I went to the shithole school. It ended up being the best school imaginable, amazing teachers and fantastic students. And there was girls there. It was a mixed school. The Christian Brothers school was all boys. And suddenly these beautiful young girls, these beautiful young teachers, these beautiful, genuinely forward-thinking, extraordinary people gave us an opportunity to explore life on a level that I have a twin brother, and he stayed with the Christian Brothers. And while they were tearing their hair out and tearing their underpants off in wedgies, like a bunch of masculine lunatics, we were too busy just trying to navigate through the beautiful intimacy of discovering somebody that you love or somebody that you fall in love with or adore. And that school and the education system and the process of that school was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. But I got a girl pregnant, and then the old classic Irish thing, I got thrown out of home, and then I came up to Dublin when I was 15. Right. And for years, I had a massive chip on my shoulder in relation to education, because I never did the intercert, I never did the leaving cert, I never did any of those things. And so while I think our education system now is far more dangerous and far more damaging than we're aware of, because it is promoting woke culture across the board, and the mediocrity of the teaching, again, has got to be rubber stamped approved in advance. So all the teachers are woke. We don't have mavericks anymore. We don't have provocateurs. We don't have anybody. But at the same time, while we have this, we had a woman brought over from England to address the Irish National Teachers Organization. She's a big figurehead over there. And she's part of an organization that wants to push, again, fundamentalist ideology when it comes to sex education in schools. And she blatantly, it's available for anyone to see, she told the Irish National Teachers Organization members to conceal from the parents what they were doing, to lie to parents. And there wasn't a single raised eyebrow from the Irish National Teachers Organization. Now, we know in our culture the consequence of protecting the lie from parents of what is being done to children, particularly in relation to sex. And here we are not only repeating it all over again, but insisting that the implementation of it is for the child's benefit. And it's about diversity or whatever other bullshit buzzword they use to inveigle their way in with a new ideology. So I fear that education, which used to be about the idea of having the courage to ask questions you don't know the answer to, has now turned into an ideological determination that you are always right and everyone else is the enemy.
We have an opportunity here to change things, to change our course. Like, as much as things are going horribly wrong, and they are, it's also an opportunity to look at, say, the mainstream media and to go, well, who's paying them to push this on us? To look at our education system and to look at the woke culture, to look at cancel culture, to look at our judiciary, to look at what kind of sentences they give, and to finally see what kind of society we're living in. And perhaps create a parallel society. Perhaps that's our best bet, along with mass non-compliance, out of this. What do you reckon?
Well, the one thing is, you just talked about, you have 3 children, and they're at those great ages. Which is 5, 8, and 10, is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So they're amazing ages. It's a half a decade between the first and the last. But with my children, you know, I got a 26-year-old, I got a 20-year-old, I got a 13-year-old, no, 14-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old.
Wow. Well, a fabulous family. Wow.
She gets me drunk every few years and takes advantage of me. But anyway, so that's like a generation between the first and the last. And I look at those kids, and despite all the attempts to indoctrinate, I'm not talking about just the schooling system or the political system, but also the home system. Despite every attempt to indoctrinate, these children seem to somehow find their own remarkable personalities and their own astonishing insights. And I think that it's going to sound trite, but I think the only thing we can do with absolute certitude is just love the shit out of our kids, no matter what. And by doing that, you remove all the trappings of ideological attempts at indoctrination. And you have to allow them to make their own mistakes. You've got to allow them to make all the things that they're going to do, because nobody knows who they are when they're young. I'm 51 now, and I still have no idea who the hell I am. But I try to live by a simple moral code that allows other people to be what they are, as long as they're not endangering me or endangering my kids. Mm-hmm. And the sad thing is that the people in power right now are clearly endangering our children. Yeah. Not because they're pedophiles, none of this, like that all extremist nonsense is just ridiculous. But I'm sure some of them are pedophiles, by the way, like in any class of society. But in general, it's not driven by that desire. It's driven by, I think power is addictive. Mm-hmm. And once you have a taste for power, you realize that nothing really compares. But these people are a clear and present threat to our children's future, economically, politically, educationally. Mm-hmm. And yet we have that article talking about the far right being a clear and present danger. And you go, this is nonsense. Those people that say are on the far right have no power whatsoever, no electorate power and no other power. But the people in actual power are destroying our education system through the force feeding of woke culture, and destroying our children's future by making us believe that every 6 months having something injected into your arm that pukes up profit for the big pharma industry mm-hmm. is the new normal. And the fact that that's happening, I think the only thing we can do that is measurable is teach our children that we adore them and we love them and to have independent thought. And part of independent thought, anybody with independent thought is going to recognize that you cannot subscribe to a fallacy and a lie that is driven by profit and driven by ideology.
Well, Terry, it's been fascinating talking to you, as I knew it would. Really appreciate your insights in all of this, and let's hope we get out of it alive and together, and keeping the channels open with the vaxxed, the unvaxxed, and as you say, love. We have to keep loving our children and loving each other and our differing opinions and whatever camps we're in, just to keep that big heart open and progress from there. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We'll be back with a brand new guest next week. In the meantime, everybody take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you next week. See you, Terry. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.